friends. Hello, friends. Kinjal, what's up? Wendy, how are you? And very impressed by the male presence. Thank you for being here. So we're going to talk about compensation, financial and non-financial, and how to get parity in your department. This is actually the merging of two different didactics, so we're going to fly through this a little bit. We want to acknowledge Dr. Amy Gottlieb, who was going to be a part of this panel and at the last minute could not be, and she has a book that really goes into the cash compensation in great detail. One of us has a disclosure, Dr. Pang, but he's still here, and the rest of us have no disclosures. Oh, look at that. Okay, so a quick roadmap. We're going to talk about salary equity, the cash version, and we had thought maybe this was a foregone conclusion. Maybe all departments already have equity, but it turns out that's not true. So we're going to go through that. Then we're going to talk about total compensation, because compensation is more than money. And then how do we achieve equity? And then we will hear from some chairs about what they consider important and how to approach them to achieve equity. So with that, each person will introduce themselves. So I'm Neha Rocker, Vice Chair at Mayo.
Nice to see everybody. I have an impaired vocal cord, apparently, so apologies in advance for my voice. We're going to talk today. I'm from Yale University. I'm one of the associate professors of emergency medicine, and I work a lot with our APP group on patient experience and on areas that interest me, and this is one, obviously, that interests all of us. Salary equity, is it a foregone conclusion? Have we already addressed this? Really interesting question. Actually, who knows what March 12th is? No? Equal Pay Day. So it's Gender Parity Day, Gender Equity Day. And it's actually a day where in the whole U.S. we examine whether or not we've actually achieved parity. This year, 2024, women were making 84 cents on the dollar compared to men. And that really gets worse, as we'll see in minority populations. And so we really need to think about this. That's all comers, right, for all jobs. But medicine is sort of a special silo where we think we have equal credentials. We've graduated from the same schools. We've done the same residency programs. We're really comparing apples to apples in many ways, and we still don't have parity. So what's the difference between these two terms, equity and parity? Equity is really looking at the systems that give individuals access to opportunities and resources to earn. Parity is the actual equivalence between salaries, so equal pay for equal work when we hear that. So does a gender gap exist in medicine? It does. This is really very discouraging, actually. It ranges anywhere from 17%. This slide says up to 28%, but in some surgical subspecialties, it can be as little as 38%. So you can imagine that's almost like half of what somebody else is making doing the same exact work. And this is really despite controlling for things like specialty, practice location, productivity. So those are all things that are brought up, well, this person does more procedures, so they earn more. But if you actually control for that, you see that there is still not parity. And this really starts from the beginning of a woman's career. So when we look at academic rank and leadership, we also see a little bit of, this isn't even looking at the leaky pipeline, which I'll talk about in a minute, but as people progress, you can see that there's less and less representation at every single level, right? So med students come in at almost equal proportions, 51%. By the time you get up to the decanal level, you're looking at 18%, right, representation of women in academic medicine. And you can see this gradual drop-off. So there's also what's known as the leaky pipeline effect. And last year, a study came, actually 2022 now, so 2 years ago, a study came out of Yale by Cameron Gettle noting that women leave the pipeline, leave academic medicine, actually leave medicine overall. I think it wasn't specific for academic medicine, 12 years earlier than men, a little bit over 12 years. So also very disconcerting. So you say, well, maybe it's because women haven't been in the specialty long enough. Maybe they're not at the levels of associate professor, and that's why we don't have parity in pay. Also not true. So if you look at every rank in leadership positions, you can see the green line is men, blue line is women. You can see this difference, this gap, right, between the two salaries. And this always also carries into the Dean Suite. So this is also a little bit discouraging. You can see academic affairs up here, admissions, clinical affairs, diversity, faculty, and research affairs, which, men tend to go into more academic affairs, clinical affairs, and so those salaries are huge. The titles and the sort of glory that's given to those areas are huge. And women tend to gravitate more towards faculty affairs, student affairs, research, more educational roles. But you can see that even with that, within each of those roles, there's a huge gap. Also another problem. And then, when we get to emergency medicine, and we're going to drill down on this a little bit more with the next speaker, you can see that people make, at the executive level, $54,000 less. In executive area, operations $27,000, and in education $17,000. So this carries over into people's ability to function, to stay in academic medicine, and we really want to emphasize that it's a moral imperative really to pay for equal work, and I feel like we should all think in that direction. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Julie Welch. I am a Vice Chair of Faculty Affairs and Development at Indiana University. Arrow down?
Oh, yeah, the little cursor right there.
Right there, okay.
Yeah, if not. Yep.
Perfect. Okay, so we're gonna go more into the academic faculty realm and look at the AAMC Faculty Salary Survey Report, the most recent one. And this was a survey of over 90,000 faculty and found that gender pay gaps exist across every specialty and clinical department, with women being paid between 72 and 96 cents on the dollar paid to men. Within our own specialty of academic emergency medicine, women are paid 93 cents to the dollar compared to men, which is a gap of 7 cents. And I want you to remember that number. It's a nickel and 2 pennies, 7 cents difference. And as you mentioned, when we look at the intersectionality of gender with race and ethnicity, these pay gaps persist and reveals further drivers within all specialties, as seen on this slide, where women across races and ethnicities are paid 67 to 77 cents per dollar compared to white men. And this gap does exist within the same race and ethnicity between women and men. In emergency medicine, looking at intersectionality, the pay gap ranges from 89 to 94 cents per dollar paid to white men. And among women in academic emergency medicine, white women are paid more than Black, Asian, and Hispanic women. So why does this matter? So, you might be thinking, well, it's 93 cents on the dollar for emergency medicine. What is that 7 cents? What do those 2 pennies and a nickel really mean? And how much effort do we really need to put into closing that 7 cents gap? Well, this table provides 3 compensation examples, compensation A, B, and C, of $250,000, $300,000, and $350,000. And if a woman is paid 93 cents on the dollar, that gender gap of 7 cents is indicated in the red there, which equates to $17,500, $21,000, and over $24,000 every year. And here's why it matters. This pay gap leads to substantial investment losses over a woman's career. And this graph shows the pay gaps of the $17,500 in blue and the $21,000 in orange. And if invested annually on a compounded standard rate of return, the exponential growth of this investment reaches, as you can see here, at 20 years, it's $1.5 million, 25 years, 2.5, and at 30 years, $4 to $5 million, which emphasizes, as we've said, or we're going to convince you of, the imperative for gender equity in salary and total compensation from the start and throughout our careers. Okay.
So this is a versed image from the New England Journal of Medicine, which shows what the components of salary are, of cash compensation, including bonuses and variable pay. And so we'll look at the different topics, and underneath we'll look at the differences in gender. So for example, base salary, that is a variable that is influenced by negotiation. So women who negotiate usually are penalized, and occupational gender segregation. Productivity is influenced by greater organizational service. So women have more service roles in their department, more domestic duties and part-time work. So women are penalized for taking care of their families and being the one that the school calls when the kid is sick, when your child is sick. And so there's more penalty against that. Women spend more time with patients, as the literature has shown, and we're penalized for going on maternity and pregnancy leave. When it comes to rank and seniority, we have more negative performance evaluations, and our evaluations have more softer terms as opposed to metrics. And we have fewer promotions. We're not promoted at the rate that men are. And when we look at leadership, we have fewer formal leadership opportunities, which is why things like the AAMC have these programs just for women. And we have, as is cited in the literature, less sponsorship opportunities in general. But then when we go to emergency medicine and think about total compensation, we have financial, like we said, basic wages and incentives, and you'll see below what makes up those categories. But then we have non-financial compensation, things like growth and support. So leadership positions, protected time, academic rank, sponsorship, which is different between the sexes, and also membership on your board. So look at your department boards and see what the breakdown is between men and women. And then we also have differences in support. For example, how many women have an administrative assistant versus the men, how many people have office space versus the men, and formal mentorship. We know that women have lots of mentors, fewer sponsors, but the mentors are not as engaged as they are with the men. So we're going to talk next about non-financial considerations.
All right, I'm Katie Pettit. I'm the Vice Chair of Education at Indiana University. I'm actually going to, before we get to the non-financial considerations, I'm going to give an example that talks about the incentive bonuses. So I realize every institution has they approach their compensation a little bit differently in terms of how it's built. So there's the base salary, and then there's variable pay, incentives, rank incentives, et cetera. So I'm just going to give an example again that's unique to Indiana University. It might not apply specifically to you, but just to kind of give you an idea of how you need to think about this. Because when we first looked into our gender analysis on salary, we said, okay, everybody has the same hourly rate. So therefore, everybody is paid the same. It doesn't matter. But that's not really the entire story. So when we started to look at our incentive pay, I just want to give an example. So let's say our base salary is $200, and we have up to $30,000 that we can get in incentive pay. For whatever reasons, historically, Indiana has given the incentives based on your clinical FTE. So any release time that you have doesn't get the incentive on that portion. However, some positions, that's not true. Some positions actually get the incentive on the entire FTE, not just the clinical FTE. So it's a little confusing. So let's just look at one quick example. So you have a medical director and you have a residency program director, both of which are 50% clinical, 50% non-clinical. So they're paid the same when you're looking at base salary. But if you have up to $30,000 incentive, the medical director actually receives incentive on their entire FTE, whereas the residency program director only receives the incentive on their clinical FTE. So you can see that ultimately gives a difference in salary of $15,000. Now, at IU, which is in the literature pretty consistent across the nation, we have more men in operational roles and we have more women in educational roles. And the education roles don't get the full incentive and operational roles do. So now all of a sudden you have a gender difference. Again, these are like the little areas that you just don't really think about, but then when you start to really dig deep and ask all of the questions, you're gonna uncover some of these things. There's also rank incentive, but I am gonna leave that to Tala to cover in her section just in the interest of time. So that's just one example for you all.
So the Mayo Clinic is famously known for having salary equity, and it is based on a stepwise progression. So for the first 5 years, each year out of residency, you get an incremental increase in your pay, and it is across men and women, it's across the specialties. Each specialty decides what their max pay is going to be, and it's totally equitable across the institution and at all of our sites. And so you would think, well, you have equal pay, what is there to talk about? But if you look at non-financial compensation, then we find a little difference. So what we did was we took 3 years of data, we went quarter by quarter, and we looked at 3 different areas. We looked at leadership position, and it had to be a titled leadership positions because there's lots of leadership positions that don't actually come with a title. So we looked at titled leadership positions, we looked at academic rank, and we looked at protected time. And we wanted to see if there was a difference between the men and the women. So when it came to leadership positions and academic rank, we found no difference. But I would say that right before the study was done, we had a female chair, and we know that departments with a female chair do a better job with promotion, specifically promotion, and making sure that the women in the department are promoted at an equal pace as the men. So we found no difference in leadership position or academic rank between the men and the women. However, when we looked at protected time, what we found is that in the first 7 years of one's career, there was a difference in protected time between the men and the women, in that the men had more protected time, even though it was the women who were having their children and so on. And we have other literature that shows, and this is national literature, that shows that when women have children, there's about an 8-year delay in promotions, right? So not only are they getting less protected time than the men when they should be clinically or having scholarly productivity, they're working more clinically, and the men have this extra jump in their ability to be scholarly. This did catch up after 7 years, which is exactly about the time it takes for the lag in promotion for women. But we found that there was no difference in the other two. So when you look at your own department, look at all of the different areas. Don't just look at salary. So we're going to take a moment because we want to have some conversation with you all about what's happening at your own institutions. Is there a salary equity? Have you had that conversation? Has anybody even looked? Or do you just assume that it's equal? And besides cash, have you gone a little bit deeper and looked at the other things like leadership positions, academic rank, and protected time?
And I have the microphone so I can pass it around. You want to do introductions and just a couple of thoughts, or? Yeah, I'll pass this.
Hi, I'm Kinjal Setharaman. I am at the University of Maryland. So our dean had a task force a few years ago where he made every single department look at pay equity by race and gender. And when they found how bad it was, he made all the chairs recalibrate. So that was nice. Now we have a new dean. I don't know if it's going to continue, but it is something that's on the minds of, I think, a lot of the chairs, at least at my institution.
Is it a yearly process?
No.
No. Okay.
I mean, I think it is behind the scenes, but not the
Hi, I'm Jimmy Trong. I'm one of the assistant professors at Columbia Medical Center in New York.
chair's awesome.
Yeah. Dr. Angela Mills is awesome. I think I was just talking to my colleague behind me, Vice Chair of Faculty Affairs, about this. But I think Angela does a really great job in making sure that everyone has equal say, equal pay, and gender equity. So she does a really great job for our department. So.
I'm Anju Wag. I'm a pediatric emergency medicine faculty at Columbia also.
And I'm Erica Olson, and I'm in the same group. But I will say, I don't know if I've ever had the detailed conversation about it. Like, we do think that Angela is always advocating for us. But if I had to say, like, do a breakdown like you just did, I could not tell you that. So that's all I'll add.
I'm just here to support, but I'm Penny Lima. I'm the Vice Chair of Faculty Affairs. I think having an open book, transparency is key, and I think that might ruffle feathers, but I think it's best to set the neutral base pay and make sure everyone is open to the books. I think you're one of the examples of the disparities in educators versus medical directors is a stark one that we probably are not cognizant of. And so that's because there's a lot of women in education.
Right.
So that's something that I'm interested in.
Yeah, that's huge.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Croteau. I'm at Mass General. I'm the admin fellow there. And I actually remember going to Liz Temin's talk as a resident where she presented some data from MGH about equity. So I believe it's equitable based on that, but I don't actually know. Great.
Hi, Wendy Chang at University of Maryland as well. I'm curious in terms of what's the best way for the leaders in being transparent and sharing data with the whole rest faculty group.
Yeah, it can make mayhem, and I think we're going to hear from both chairs shortly about how to approach that.
Matt Stahl, I'm a program director at Case Western in Cleveland. I've advocated for a long time of open book transparency and constantly told that's not acceptable. And so, because I think there's likely a gap. I'm the P&T chair of our group, and there's no doubt a huge gap between we only have one full professor, but associate and assistants. We have no women associates at this point. We are a young faculty group, but ultimately it is. Yeah, there's a disparity there that I'm interested in figuring out how to convince my chair that open book is actually legal / allowed.
Good job.
Hey, I'm Lauren Walter. I'm from the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and we got a new chair 3 years ago, Dr. Ellie, and when she came in, she created a compensation committee, and they very much tried to make it very transparent. And so if you're come in as an assistant professor, here you're 1, you're here, you're 2, all the way up to year 5 when you max out, and then it goes to associate and professor, very clear. I think the thing that's been more challenging is that we have a lot of different roles and titles, and some come with effort and some don't. And so finding that parity has been very challenging. A lot of this not apples to oranges there. So that's the next big task for that committee, which I'm not on, thankfully.
Thank you.
To your point, though, it does become a source of fear when you say to your chair or you say to your colleagues, we're going to open the books, right? Because people are afraid that they're going to lose their special deal or whatever they have, right? But at the end, if you have it transparent, and I think one way to approach it is a compensation committee, or having what we did at my prior institution was we had all the women get together, and we were about 40% women, get together and create a committee and say, we want to look at this, we want to just know, we don't care for the amount, we just want to know, we want you to look at this, we want somebody to look at this, and not just cash. Cash is easy because it's black and white, but we want somebody to look at this and just see what the disparity is. So we have 2 examples of analyses and how this went down.
Hi, so I'm Liz Temin. I'm from Mass General. So we're going to, myself and Dr. Alia are going to talk a little bit about kind of what we did at our facility and how we went through this, and what is still a lot left to do. So for me, this started in 2019. I was getting ready for my annual review with my chair, and that week, for some reason, there was a lot of stuff in the lay press about inequality in gender salaries. And so I went into my annual review kind of with this, having read this every morning in the paper for some big study must have just come out. And so when he talked to me at the end of the review about kind of what my salary was going to be for the next year, I said, fortunately I felt comfortable enough with him to be able to do this, but I said, hey, there's been all this information in the press about salary equity. Where do I stand compared to the men in my department who work about the same? And he said, well, we try and make it really equal. I think you're doing well, but let's look at it. And so he did a full analysis at that time based on kind of my pushing, gently, hopefully. So I feel really lucky that he was receptive to that, because I don't think that's always the case, but he was. And so when we looked in our department, it was, so, he's always tried, so this is our former chair, had always tried to have the salary in our department be at the kind of 75th level nationally from the SAEM data, with a standard increase then for every academic rank. At Harvard, everybody starts as an instructor, so that level is in there. And then since then, actually, our subsequent chairs has put in kind of more standardized increases for leadership roles and for educational teaching. So when we looked at our data, and the salary analysis I'll show you excludes our chair and our executive vice chair, all our non-clinical faculty, and our PEM faculty. It also adjusts up to 1 FTE. So if you bought yourself down or are working part-time, your salary assessment in this was as if you were, up to full-time. We can argue whether that is really the way to do it, and I do think that kind of some of future analysis needs to be who's being bought down, how, who's taking part-time kind of voluntarily in pay cuts. And so I think that's part of a subsequent analysis that we should do. So this is our data. I don't have the 2019 data in there because, as I said, it was done under a different chair, and so the how we parsed it out was a little different. So the first data had instructor and assistant professor together, and then since after COVID, everything stopped, and then we got a new chair. And fortunately, our new chair has been also willing to look at this information. So we've been looking at this then yearly since. So this is female to male ratio. You can see an instructor. The men make a little bit more, an assistant professor, the women are a little more, but they're all pretty equal, associate professor. We don't have full professor up here because we have no women full professors in our department. So, and so that was one of the other things we looked at. So we looked at academic rank by gender. So if you look in 2019, we had 28 men and 12 women in our department. And as you can see, we had 11 associate professors and 3 full professors who were male. We had 3 associate professors who were women, and that's it. And to his credit, our chair at the time looked at this information and said, oh, I kind of didn't realize that this was such a discrepancy. This is something I need to focus on. And I really think that brings to bear the fact that you don't know what's there unless you look at it, right? And so you can make all the assumptions you want that, yes, I pay people evenly, I try and do everything equally, but unless you actually look at the data, sometimes you find things that you didn't expect. And so, he and then our subsequent chair have made a conscious effort to try and increase the women at higher academic ranks. And you can see as of this year, we have, we're up from 3 to 6 associate professors. We still don't have any full professors, but we are hopefully working on it. We also looked at leadership roles by gender. And so the blue is primary leadership roles. So these are, chairs, vice chairs, program directors, division chiefs. The gray is secondary, so associate and assistant directors and medical directors. And you can see in 2019, we had 6 male primary leadership roles, men in primary leadership roles, and 10 in secondary. And women, we only had 3. And again, our chair was like, oh, that's not good, and made a real effort. And by this year, we're in a much better situation where we have, 10 men in primary leadership roles, and we have 7 women. And the total is 15 and 11. So we're in a much better state. But again, identifying this and looking through it really can make the difference. I will say that I have brought this to our to other departments in our at MGH. So I've presented this with this information to the Department of Medicine and to kind of pediatrics, and to hopefully give them some data and some, again, a gentle push to look at it within their own departments. I can't say what's going to happen. I have brought this to HR to try and do this, and I have been told categorically that they will not do this across the entire MGB system, that it is illegal to kind of portray salaries there. I think they're worried about, legal ramifications, that if someone finds out that they've been paid worse, they're going to sue. I don't know. But so I've been told that that is not allowed multiple times. And I've been thinking about this now for 10 years or so, and been on, women's committees and so on, and I've brought this up every couple of years, and I'm always shut down. But the one saving grace, I hope, is that MGB is now creating a very high level, with the evolution of Mass General Brigham and bringing all of these hospitals together, they're creating administrative levels ad nauseum. But one of those will be someone whose role is to look at compensation overall, and so I'm hopeful that that will result in better equity.
Hey there, I'm Tala Ilya. I'm an associate professor at UMass Bay State, and we undertook a similar analysis at our institution that started actually about the same time. And when we first undertook this, the first thing we did was look at our salary tiers. So we had a tiered structure of salary. People typically came in at the C-level salary at instructor level, and then after about 3 years of experience and appointment to assistant professor, they moved into that B level. Progression into those B plus and A levels were contingent on academic promotion to associate professor, full professor, or with certain leadership roles. And so when we first undertook this, starting in 2019 as well, we looked at each of these salary tiers, and we looked at men and women within each of these buckets. And we found that men and women made the same salaries within each tier. So men and women in the C level were making the same salary in the B level as well. But then when we looked closer at progression, were women progressing into the other tiers as the same rate as we expected was the representation? We found that though there was equal representation in the lower two tiers, in that C and B level, there was really a steep drop off, and we didn't have representation of women in the higher salary levels. Actually, I had no women in that B plus level and only one in that upper level. And so we said, what was happening in 2019? And more importantly, what was happening, say, 15 years before? And what we did know was that 15 years before this analysis undertaken, there weren't really a lot of female physicians in our department. There were actually very few. And when we looked at this point in time, at the average years of practice of men versus women in our department, we found that women had been in practice for about 7.5 years on median, and men about 14 years. And when we broke that down into those salary tiers, what we found was that in that B level, the time that people would start progressing from that B level salary to that higher B plus level salary took about 6 to 8 years. And remember, women were in practice about 7.5 years, so we were really at a pivotal point in time here. We hadn't seen women starting to progress, but we really should at this point. And so at that point, we had a commitment from our leadership, having presented this data, to say we're not going to do this as a single snapshot in time. This is clearly something that is timely to focus on now and something that we need to look at in a longitudinal way. So we had a commitment to look at this, ideally annually, present it in a transparent way to the entire faculty, and at the same time, take note of the things that we needed to see this progression and representation continue in the way that it should. In particular, support women in the promotions process, look at who was being encouraged for promotion, and also look at leadership positions. Were positions being open to all? Were women being offered the same leadership positions as men? And those who held leadership positions, were those positions that they held being appropriately compensated and categorized in those B plus and A level salaries if they had those responsibilities? So we did undertake this the year after in 2019, 2020. We admittedly had a long pause for COVID and just undertook the work again. And what we have seen with time, with this increased focus, transparency, and support, that we have seen women progressing into those higher leadership, those higher salary tiers, to the point where we now have equal representation in those middle tiers and increased representation in the highest tier of salary. So, some of the things that we saw at both our institutions was really increased transparency was key to identifying those gaps, because we need to know where the gaps are to be able to address them. And I will say, I initially approached this. I was the one who approached my chair at the time saying, hey, we'd like some transparency. What I asked for initially was complete salary transparency. Let's just open the books. And I got a categorical hard no. And so we proposed this approach where we did this in a sort of aggregate way, but then presented it transparently. So the transparency really was key. And then looking at increasing gender equity in both in academic rank and leadership positions was a key crucial driver in terms of salary progression. And some of the concrete things we did, supporting women's groups, both these institutions, and then actively recruiting women for leadership roles, and again, supporting women in the promotion process were really important concrete steps to be able to see this progression.
So I'm going to ask Dr. Angela Mills and Dr. Peter Peng to come up. Angela, as you know, is from Columbia. Peter Pang is from Indiana University, and they're going to give us a little bit of a different perspective from the chair's view.
I don't know about different, but so good morning, everyone. So I joined as the chair at Columbia about 6 years ago, and it was a great opportunity. At the time, we weren't an academic department, so were two divisions, EM under medicine and pediatric EM under peds, and so they brought those two together to make a department. And if you could imagine, there were, whatever, it was a new department. I'll just say departments of medicine and pediatrics. I don't know, I don't think the emergency medicine kind of faculty were at the top of their list, if you can imagine, right? So there was a lot of work to be done, a lot of guidelines, policies, things to put together. And so one of the things we did very early on was to review all the salaries. And so between my department administrator, our HR, we went through all the salaries. And it was quite complex, right? Because I think there weren't any scales or whatever. There was maybe a starting salary. There were some people who had been there 30 years working, right? And there weren't really records. And you could imagine some years there might have been a 2% increase. Some years there might have been a 5% increase. Some years there might have adjusted. And it was really hard to figure out, what's going on. So, and why were some salaries higher, lower? When did people start? It was very complex. And just to say that, I don't want to say it was impossible. It felt impossible to figure out everything. So we tried to model and say, okay, what's the average increase that people got? What's the whatever? And so we made a little model and tried to figure out how are people paid. And we found, I'll say more than a handful of people, all women, whose salaries were lower than what we had modeled. And so we adjusted all of those people. We met with those people. We told them, oh, your salary seems like it's discrepant. We're going to adjust it and bring it up. We decided we weren't going to bring anyone's salary down. I didn't think that that was fair, right? I mean, people had been working in a system, and whatever it was, the salaries were what they were. And again, it was hard to figure out. Did everybody get a 5% increase? And these people have been here 35 years, and that's why their salaries are higher versus this person had only been here for 5 years, and they didn't have as much of an increase, right? I mean, I think hopefully all of our salaries over time do go up, right? There's cost of living, there's inflation, et cetera. But I felt very good about that, and then we brought it to the dean's office and showed them, and everybody reviewed it, and everybody was good with the increases we were giving. But I think it's just to say, and I'm not against transparency of salaries, but I do think that there's a lot of nuance and a lot of nuances and a lot of things that maybe in other departments, in your departments, everything's been recorded. We didn't have that a luxury, unfortunately. And I do think making it completely transparent, I don't know, could cause more problems when there probably aren't as many problems. But people, I think it's just hard for people to understand. Well, you're making $10 more than I am. Why, right? Rather than trying to understand you've been here 10 years longer than I have. And I don't know, I just think some of these were a little difficult. So I don't know, we can discuss that more, but just wanted to share that experience. In addition, as we were talking about non-financial compensation, we went through, roles, time, and it was very clear. It seemed like folks had deals, right? I'm sure, a lot of people talk about this. People had deals, and it wasn't clear why people had deals. Okay, some people, they're the medical director, they're the program director, but then there were other people who were working 8 hours a week and they didn't have a title. And I was like, why is this person working 8 hours a week? I couldn't understand it, right? And so, as a new chair, you have to be very, whatever, you have to be diplomatic, you got to meet with me, you got to try to understand, you can't just change everybody, right? Like that, that wouldn't work. And I think the other challenge that was difficult for us, so when I got there, and nobody told me, I think everybody lied. I met with 100 people, not one person told me that there were like 25 open faculty lines when I got there. Not one person told me this. And I was like trying to argue with the dean and the CEO to like give me some faculty positions so I could recruit. And everyone's like, oh, don't worry, when you get here, we'll figure it out. And anyway, no one told me. 25 open lines, and they had a locums group staffing in the ED, teaching the residents. And I was like, oh my God, where am I? What did I do? Why did I leave? Where am I? Anyway, so because of that, and over time, I ended up, which is a good thing, but I ended up hiring a lot of people, right? So if you look at the whole makeup, we have 145 faculty. So if you look at the faculty, I don't know the exact numbers, maybe Penny knows, but, I would say over half, like I recruited, or, and all the folks that were recruited, we started we started a salary scale, right? And so it's a very transparent salary scale. It's based on rank. So we have, assistant, associate, professor, et cetera. And then we have some like stipends, like if you've been practicing more than 5 years, you get this stipend. I don't know, if you've been practicing 6 to 10, you get whatever, things like that. And then there's some stipends, like if you're a nocturnist but again, it's very transparent. Everyone follows that. And again, we tried to make sure that everybody who had been there before me, fit somewhat into the salary scale. It wasn't perfect, but fit pretty well into it. So I feel very positive, at least in the past 6 years, everyone who's been hired, there's complete parity in there. And it's very transparent. Anyway, so we were looking at the roles, and I think one of the take-home points that I had was really that protected time should be about a role, not about a person, right? So whether a male person or female person come and apply for the role, it's the same job, right? You're the program director comes with X. You're the medical director, it comes with Y, whatever it is, right? And I just think something to think about, all roles are not exactly the same, right? Like a 50% role in one thing might not also include that you have to be on call 10 days out a month where the nurses are calling you at 3 in the morning to go on diversion or whatever it is, right? And so, and I completely recognize, and I'm come from an operations background, that we have very, very few women in operations. But having done operations, like they are different roles than some of the education roles. Again, it's not to say the education people don't work incredibly hard, and it depends on where you're at. Like if you're running a residency of 10 people, it's different than if you're running a residency of 100 people. If you're overseeing one hospital with 20,000 visits, very different than if you're overseeing 4 hospitals with 250,000 visits, right? And so I think that's also something to keep in mind, like when you talk to your friends at another institution and they say, oh, we get 25% for this role, understanding where are you starting from? Like we were having this discussion the other day, like in New York City, most faculty, they start at like 1,500 hours a year versus if you're in Boston, I'll just say, right, you might start at 1,200 hours a year, right? And so taking 10% off of 1,200 is very different than taking 10% off of 1,500, right? And so again, like I think when folks ask questions, it's really important to get all the details because I think sometimes it gets lost and you're not comparing apples to apples. But anyway, getting back to my I'm rambling here. Getting back to the discussion about roles, if you can imagine, so I hired a lot of people up front and there got to be some tensions in the department of like, are you a BA or an AA? Are you before Angela or after Angela hire? And it was rough, and it was very like disturbing for me because it's like your kids, like all your kids are different and you love your kids individually for who they are, but you love them all the same, hopefully, right? And it's like your faculty, like I love all my faculty the same, right? I didn't want anyone to think that because I didn't hire you, you were anything different than somebody who I hired. But there got to be this something. And again, it was like, well, Angela's questioning why I have this role that I'm only working 8 hours a week. And, why is she questioning that? And obviously those were people who I hadn't hired, right? And those are people who were a little more senior, had been there a little bit. So I think it took a lot, right? And some people's things got changed a little bit earlier. Some people took a little bit longer. And again, it didn't matter whether you had a female chief leader or a male chief leader. There were discrepancies across the board. And I think hopefully that the leaders, right, whether you're chair or vice chair, et cetera, approach these things really thoughtfully, right? Because at the end of the day, I feel it's the leader's role to develop roles for these things, to determine, okay, this role, we're going to say it's a 50% role or whatever it is, and then hold people accountable, right? If you are working 8 hours a week, why are you working 8 hours a week and what are you doing, right? I mean, I was trying, it's not the faculty's fault, like that's the deal they were given or whatever. So I don't know, it's just to say I think some of these things are a little bit, they're complex, and I hope as leaders, like we try to be thoughtful about it, right? And I think I wanted everyone to feel valued in the department, and I wanted everyone to feel that they had an opportunity to understand the system and have it be more transparent. So, am I over my 5 minutes? Am I good? Okay, good. We'll transition. All right, thanks. I'm happy to answer questions.
Really interesting. It's like an opportunity when you're new to kind of put everything in order.
So good morning. My name is Peter. I'm the chair at Indiana University. you know, I'll be honest, when I became the chair 3 or 4 years ago, I didn't know much about gender equity or parity. I'm still no expert by any stretch of the imagination. And honestly, I'll admit also, maybe shamefully, that I don't think I would have looked at salary equity unless I'd been asked. I don't think I would have looked. But I was asked. I was asked by 2 of our amazing leaders who you got to hear from today. So it's Dr. Pettit and Dr. Welch, and they asked me to look at it. Actually, I got super curious. I'm sure I also got super defensive. But I actually was curious, so I'll focus on the curious part. And we began to look. And I think that's what really kicked off our journey at IU, but it really built upon, I don't want to forget to acknowledge the hard work that the women faculty and the faculty at IU have done for over 2 decades to kind of get to a point that's building upon that work. So I want to make sure I acknowledge that. But I got curious. I mean, curious enough to be able to, as we were looking at this, doing the work on transparency, looking at salary equity, and then beginning to look at other roles, I began to ask, you know, what would it take, you know, for IU to become nationally known as one of the best places to work for women in emergency medicine? And so it's been a good journey. It hasn't been a perfect one by any stretch. I've made a ton of mistakes. I'm quite grateful to our faculty to kind of make sure that we're continuing in the right direction, but it's been a good one. And so it looks like Angela's faculty loves her more than they love me because there's more of them. But yeah, I think I just wanted to say that it's been a good one for me, a good lesson, I think, from my standpoint as the chair, and to really encourage you to ask the question. And one of the things, too, is that, I mean, I think all chairs are thinking about, like, growth or recruitment or retention. You know, it's hard for me to envision any scenario where you can have any of those things unless you have a foundational or fundamental commitment to making it equitable, right? How do your faculty thrive if they feel like it's unfair or it's not equitable, right? So I think whatever the approach that you might take with your chair, I think that overall idea of trying to create a great department is something that all chairs would be interested in. So I think we have time for questions, right, for the whole panel?
Yeah, it would be nice. We have the room for another 10 minutes, and we have, well, we actually don't. We have 3 minutes until we're supposed to transition, but let's take like 5 minutes at least for some questions for the chairs. I'll come distribute the microphone. Any questions, thoughts?
I think the advice I've gotten over the years is that there's like the money and then there's all the non-money. So what's the best way for a faculty member to approach you about like, hey, I need an office maybe, or, you know, what's the right approach and the most effective approach, and what's a turnoff?
Oh, thank you. Okay, thanks. I want to say just ask, but maybe that's easy for me to say. Personally, I find that what you're describing, the office, administrative support, project manager support, startup, like those things are actually probably the real like issue to me and when I think about equity, because I think the salary should be transparent. It's not easy, but that's the easier part of the conversation. I think each place is so unique and different, right, that it's hard for me to say what would be universal. I know what I would say is I hope you feel comfortable asking, but that's easy for me to say from my point of view. One of the things that occasionally I do for people who are asking is it can work sometimes as what I call like a marriage broker, for lack of a better word. You could ask someone else, right, to kind of ask like, how does it work? And as they petition or things like that, it's like, what have people noticed is the best way to kind of advance this going forward. I don't know if that's very helpful, though.
Yeah, I would say the same. I mean, hopefully you have a relationship that you can ask the chair, but if not, I think using someone else in the department who you trust and just talking it over with them. You know, it's interesting that like the office space thing, where I think people were always asking for it, et cetera, and then, New York City, we don't have a ton of space to begin with, but now, like, I walk around and no one's in the office. Like, it's a fascinating thing. I'm like, everybody fought for this office space, yes, no one's here. So it's interesting. I think that's the other thing, is to think about, like, if you're going to ask for something, then hopefully you use it, right? Or you're around. And I think the same thing with the admin assistants, right? from my point of view, if people have roles in the department, if they're doing work for the department, then they should have assistants, right? And they should be able to go for help. And most of the admin assistants in our department, I think, do have some bandwidth, right, to take on new things and take on. And if they don't, then we need to review that and say, oh, maybe we need to hire another FTE for an admin assist to provide more. But I think sometimes, like if you were saying a turnoff, like I guess if you're doing things or work that aren't for the department, or it's not a turnoff per se, but it's like, okay, how do we support this if it's not for the department, right? Like, because a lot of people do great work or do great things, and it depends, like if it's coming for the hospital or for the school, or maybe it's for something outside of the system, right? How do we support that in a way? Because we want people to get promoted, and all those things help with that. So I think sometimes it's more of just where does the funding come from, or how do we approach it?
I was just going to say that you would expect that office space would be something that's given to everyone, but it's really not. But what we did at my prior job was our chair understood that not everybody used their office space, and real estate was very limited. And so he would pay people. If you didn't want to come to the office, you got this like menial bonus, but it was just like a one-time, you don't have to come to the office. You don't get an office, but then everybody else who was going to be in the office would get space. And then they had to say that they would be in the office, and there was like a day or two of the week that we had to be there. That's one way to solve that problem.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm just loud. The major part of what I took away from this, obviously, is the equity piece often is perhaps exacerbated by the delay, the 7-year delay that was really focused on. Ironically, our department is very different in that education is led by males, and operations is actually female dominated. But I'm having trouble getting them promoted because ops is not in a classically, academic environment rewarded in any way, shape, or form as an academic outlet. Does anyone have suggestions of how to support that?
Yeah, I'll say, obviously each school is going to have different criteria to get promoted and things. I've tried to encourage the ops and quality and that kind of team to really work in teams. Like for us, it doesn't matter if you're first author, last author, and they also count things like book chapters. Like it doesn't have to be a peer-reviewed article, right? And so trying to give folks, opportunities to publish or do scholarly work, and really encouraging people to get together and do things, right? Like one of our faculty, Jimmy, is on editorial board for the Journal of Visual Emergency Medicine, right? And there's a lot of great case reports that the group will write up with a resident or with one of our physician assistants, and it's been really nice. And people get involved in the scholarly process, right? And it's helped people advance. And again, it doesn't have to. It's not just for people who are in research or in education, right? It can also apply to the ops people.
Yeah, I think for us. Again, Julie leads this for us for our faculty development and promotion and tenure. Oh, I forgot the name of the exact title, which is terrible. But essentially, it's how do you turn your everyday work into publication and scholarship, right? And so it's something, I think you did this when I was there in 2014 when I moved. It's been going on quite some time. But I think the same approach is it's a team game. Because it's hard to be good at everything, right? And so but without the operations folks, the enterprise doesn't work, right? And so I think building that team and creating that culture or structure that facilitates that has probably been the best way to ensure authorship, scholarship, and opportunities are there, and to try to create that environment.
Also, we've had a few faculty in our institution that are just really great at pumping out publications, and they've partnered with some of the operational people where they're just like, hey, can you bring this person on for this publication, give them an assigned task, let them participate, but that mentorship to kind of help with that. So.
And Dr. Peng financially incentivized that mentor to work with, gave that person a title, and then they're working with the operations people. Yeah, so I think that was a big piece.
But that's not equitable. Right? What we're saying then is you have to do more than what you're already doing. They're on call 24/7. When we go to Code Red or whatever the heck, Code Omega, we have all these stupid codes that we're always at in the emergency department because everyone's boarded. But they are getting calls at 3 a.m. and then have to come into work, and you're saying still publish, right?
Well, if you want to go up for academic rank, our school sets those standards for academic rank. But other schools have different. Do you have a different?
The salary increases, right? we have a tier, so associate does get more money. So there is an incentive in that sense that there's a financial reward, if you will, to go up. So, but we do try to make it as easy as possible. But I totally agree with you. It is more work, if you will, right, to get promoted.
Yeah, in operations, we've really come to that sort of group model where if somebody's writing something, but we've all worked on the intervention, we're all on the paper, and that really helps a lot to promote everybody. And Gail D'Onofrio gave me the best advice ever because I have weird interests like patient experience, APPs, work in Armenia. She said, whatever you do, just write about it. And so every single thing I do, I try and write about it. And that's not easy, right? A lot of late nights and a lot of extra sweat equity, but pays off eventually. One more question, and then I think we have to leave the room.
Oh, it's just a comment about working in teams. At our institution, we have a really great, robust QA process with the Vice Chair of Quality, and we actually have a peer support group that we've actually launched out for the whole department, and we just gave a didactic on it. So this combination of working collaboratively to create these scholarly projects and help with promotions is super important. So if you find that specific niche to be able to pair and unite those two domains, it could be worthwhile.
So apologies about all the manuscripts on Code Omega, but
I would say, look at all the other specialties. They have so many authors, especially the surgical ones and the cardiology, and it's like everybody in the department is on every paper. And the one thing I'll say is we had an education paper published from a different department with 23 authors, and it was on education. Not one woman was an author. And so be aware of who's on these teams and try to keep some equity there as well.
Great point. Any other closing comments? No. Thank you guys so much for coming.